The anti-war movement is dead. It was killed by the so-called progressive left. It was on life support at the end of the Bush administration and killed by establishment liberals during the Obama years. During the election campaign in 2008, candidate Obama promised to bring home the troops.
I will promise you this, that if we have not gotten our troops out by the time I am president, it is the first thing I will do. I will get our troops home. We will bring an end to this war. You can take that to the bank.
Obama said he would end the war in Iraq and bring the one in Afghanistan to a successful conclusion. After he was in office, he continued the war agenda of his predecessor. After Obama was elected, amnesia kicked in for Democrats. They didn't oppose a continuation of America's longest war in Afghanistan. They didn't protest against Obama's illegal drone war in Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, and Syria. But what's really telling is their enthusiastic support of Obama and Hillary Clinton's brutal destruction of Libya, a manufactured conflict that killed over 30,000 people. Following the destruction, Clinton took to the establishment media to peddle lies about the invasion.
We were looking at a potential disaster as Gaddafi threatened to massacre large numbers of his population. The Europeans, our Arab allies, were urging us to help them to try to prevent that. After due diligence, we came up with a way of supporting their efforts that did not cost a single American life, and we saved a lot of Libyan lives.
During the reign of Bush, thousands of Democrats protested against the invasion of Iraq. After Obama's election victory, however, they fell in line behind the war agenda. A few Democrats, however, told the truth about the invasion.
Simply put, the president has no constitutional authority to do what he's done. He has changed the Constitution, in effect, by saying that he has an executive privilege to wage war. He's ignored Article 1, Section 8. He's ignored the War Powers Act. He's even exceeded the UN mandate. And so this administration has taken this country on a path that is profoundly anti-democratic, and it needs to be challenged.
Both world wars, Korea and Vietnam, can be laid at the doorstep of Democrat administrations. Democrat Harry Truman dropped the atomic bombs on Japan, killing nearly 150,000 people. In Vietnam, Korea, and Iraq, between 10 and 15 million people were killed by the United States. Although the invasion of Iraq occurred under Republican George W. Bush, Democrats in Congress voted for the war, which was illegal under international legal conventions which the United States government is legally bound to uphold. The Iraq War resolution also represented a violation of the United Nations Charter. Under the Charter, no member state has the right to enforce any resolution militarily unless the UN Security Council determines that there has been a material breach of its resolution, decides that all non-military means of enforcement have been exhausted, and then specifically authorizes the use of military force. The only other exception for the use of force is in self-defense against armed attack, which even the Bush administration admitted had not taken place. A few world leaders, including Russia's Vladimir Putin, denounced the attack and the murder of Gaddafi.
The coalition said destroying Gaddafi was not their goal. Then why bomb his palaces? Now some officials have claimed that eliminating him was in fact their goal. Who gave them that right? Did he have a fair trial? Returning to the no-fly zone, the bombings are destroying the country's entire infrastructure. When the so-called civilized world uses all its military power against a small country destroying what's been created by generations, I don't know if that's good.
As we now know, and many of us knew at the time, the invasion of Iraq was based on lies about weapons of mass destruction. A tiny number of Democrats called for the impeachment of Bush, but this gained almost zero traction in Congress. Democrats and Republicans alike used these obvious lies to call for an illegal invasion. Bush used the support of Democrats to insist taking out Saddam Hussein was supported by the American people. The unsubstantiated claims were were supported by Reid, Biden, Clinton, Kerry, and other Democrat Senate leaders. Hillary Clinton accepted the lies as fact and voted for the invasion resolution. During the 2016 election, however, Clinton tried to minimize her support for a war that killed 1.5 million Iraqis.
Well, Bernie Sanders voted for it.
I don't know why he did.
Well, Chris, I'm just telling you that that was the prevailing opinion. And look, I've said it was a mistake.
Obama's Vice President, Joe Biden, at the time the influential chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, used his position to block opposition by a minority of Democrats. Biden not only blocked testimony by UN inspectors such as Scott Ritter, he also said everyone in the world thought Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. The media, led by the New York Times and the Washington Post, headlined the lies about weapons of mass destruction. They also underplayed and glossed over massive anti-war demonstrations in America and Europe. Many Democrats were at the forefront of the anti-war movement in the late 1960s, but this changed after the invasion of Iraq and later during the 2016 election. Hillary Clinton, a former supporter of Barry Goldwater, led the effort to convert Democrats into the cutting edge of the war party. She embraced the neocon philosophy of so-called preemptive war and added an element to entice Democrats and liberals, using the military in the name of humanitarian intervention.
Military humanitarian intervention is when civilians are under stress, when they are starving or under attack, and the international community, maybe the United States, decides that they need to go in and help these people, and that in order to do that, they're going to need the military for logistics or for protection.
The humanitarian intervention concept is not new. Bill Clinton rolled it out when he teamed up with NATO to bomb Yugoslavia. It was cited when liberals called for direct involvement in Rwanda, where Tutsi-led rebels were slaughtering Hutu refugees. The French cited the humanitarian intervention concept when they initiated Operation Turquoise in 1994 and invaded the Great Lakes region of Africa, where they supported a brutal and genocidal regime. It was also used to argue for military intervention in oil-rich Sudan.
78 days of bombing of Yugoslavia under the auspices of NATO. Wesley Clark was the commander of those operations, the Supreme Allied Commander. They bombed a Serbian television station, killing 16 media workers. Some of them were media workers, some of them were makeup artists, others were engineers. They directly targeted passenger trains and then fabricated a video afterwards to make it seem as though it was a split-second decision. They killed thousands of civilians, and the fact was that the exaggerations of what was happening in Kosovo by William Cohen, the defense secretary at the time, who talked about 1 million missing people, and then it was scaled back to 100,000, then 50,000, then 10,000, and now the official numbers is that there were 2,700 people that were killed, and there's been no determination of their ethnicity. Now, I can tell you from being on the ground in Kosovo that some of the worst violence that occurred, slaughtering of Albanians, happened after the NATO bombing began. And the fact was that the U.S. sabotaged the work of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in the weeks leading up to the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia. And I think that what we have to understand here is that this is where the sort of liberals like Hillary Clinton come together with the neocons, because there are a lot of similarities between what happened in Yugoslavia and what happened in Iraq, with the lead up to the war, the disregard for international law or international consensus, and then the outright killing of civilians under the auspices of humanitarian intervention.
Obama used the humanitarian intervention argument when he argued in favor of intervening in Syria to fight the Islamic State. His UN ambassador, Samantha Power, is a staunch advocate of invasion and murder under the banner of humanitarian intervention. Susan Rice, Obama's national security advisor, is also an advocate of the concept. Power has argued that diplomacy is useless and only military intervention is effective.
Well, diplomacy has not delivered for the people of Aleppo, that's for sure, but I think it's a diversion to focus on diplomacy. The reason that Aleppo is burning is because the Syrian government, Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah have chosen to make it burn.
According to a leaked email between then Secretary of State Clinton and her aide, Sidney Blumenthal, The excuse of humanitarian intervention in Libya stood on shaky ground. In other words, there was no humanitarian basis for the invasion, which ultimately killed 30,000 people. In addition to lying about the real situation in Libya, the Obama administration refused to consider a ceasefire proposed by the Libyan leader Gaddafi, who was later brutally murdered by U.S.-supported so-called rebels.
The story in Libya is not dissimilar to the story in Iraq with Saddam Hussein or with Syria, which we've just been talking about. You know, the problem is these are all divided societies, politically divided. To some extent, of course, the ethnic and question of tribe should play a role, but they are politically divided societies. To assume somehow that in each of these societies there's one bad guy who everybody hates is the most simplistic understanding of the Middle East. And the United States, you know, through NATO, conducted a regime change operation inside Libya, just as they did in Iraq. In both instances, when the strongman was captured, when Saddam was captured, when Gaddafi was captured, what they said to their captors is very revealing. They said, we are ready to negotiate. And the United States essentially was not interested in negotiating. You'll remember when Gaddafi was essentially lynched on the streets of Sirte, Hillary Clinton heard the news and laughed and said, we came, we saw, we killed. You know, we conquered.
Yes, we came, we saw, he died.
Libya subsequently went from the richest nation in Africa to a failed state. In fact, the objective of the U.S. and NATO was to reduce Libya to a failed state. It didn't intend to save civilians or deliver democracy, as proponents of the invasion argued. George W. Bush dismissed the anti-war movement as a focus group, but this did not stop tens of millions of people from protesting against the war. No such protests have been repeated despite Obama continuing the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, flattening Libya, and feeding the mass carnage in Syria by covertly and not so covertly supporting jihadi terrorists, trying to overthrow the elected leader of the country. In essence, the leaders of the anti-war movement stepped down after Obama was elected, thus betraying their pseudo-leftism and opposition to war. Instead of standing behind principle, they merged with the Democrat Party, which services the financial elite in the military-industrial complex, in the same way their Republican colleagues on the other side of the aisle do. This is not strictly an American phenomenon. The French New Anti-Capitalist Party and the German Left Party, for example, have backed wars for regime change in Libya and Syria on the pretext of human rights. Even more telling is their support for the U.S. State Department and establishment NGO-created color revolutions in the Middle East. Gilbert Achcar, speaking for the French left, went so far as to meet with Syrian National Council officials and advise them on how best to get a war going and suppress opposition to it. In America, leftists like Juan Cole, who opposed the Iraq War, supported the illegal invasion of Libya under the phony rubric of humanitarian intervention. Cole became a liberal apologist for military intervention.
But in Libya, it made a difference. It saved Benghazi. It saved this popular protest movement, which, by the way, includes so many workers and ordinary people. Some of the cities which have thrown off Gaddafi, like Misrata, were known, for instance, for their steel mill. These are progressive forces who were fighting a wretched secret police regime.
Socialists and communists are particularly fond of aggressive war. The International Socialist Organization in the U.S. that identifies with Trotskyism, Leninism, and Marxism criticized Obama for not being enough of a warmonger. A number of activists and media organizations on the left take money from establishment foundations, with known ties to the CIA, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, and others. In his book, Trading with the Enemy, Charles Hingham documents how both the Rockefeller and Ford Foundations collaborated with Nazi Germany, the Rockefellers by selling the Nazis oil through the Standard Oil Company, and the Fords by selling the Nazis tanks through subsidiary corporations. Since 1950, a Rockefeller has held a prominent leadership position in the Council on Foreign Relations, and David Rockefeller was the co-founder of the Trilateral Commission. Both organizations helped craft the Carter Doctrine of the late 1970s, which stated the U.S. would intervene militarily to protect its oil supply from the Middle East.
Let our position be absolutely clear. An attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States of America and such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force.
The Council on Foreign Relations is a clearinghouse for the financial elite. It's a driving force behind corporate globalization and its institutions, including the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, and NATO. The billionaire George Soros also plays a key role in making sure Democrats and benighted liberals support endless wars and mass murder. He makes his money in part by investing in the arm-dealing Carlyle Group and holding stock in weapons manufacturers Boeing and Lockheed Martin. Soros is a former director of the CFR and a member of the Bilderberg Group. The bipartisan group membership has included the likes of Paul Wolfowitz, David Rockefeller, Colin Powell, Henry Kissinger, Vernon Jordan, Melinda Gates, Bill Clinton, and Alan Greenspan. It works in tandem with the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. Due to establishment media propaganda and the promotion of mindless partisan warfare, Democrats were able to shut down the anti-war movement by attributing wars to Republicans, specifically Bush and his neocons. Like Jimmy Carter before him, Obama is considered a humanitarian who only resorts to armed intervention as a last resort. Now that Donald Trump is president, we can expect an artificial resurgence of the phony anti-war movement. Doing this will serve as further evidence that liberals are opposed to war only when a Republican is in office.